Well, I think that there are different degrees of awareness of the potential of conflict transformation in different parts of the global south. No question that Latin America is well placed to share and perhaps to give more than to receive. But even if you go to traditional cultures of conflict resolution, you may find in some indigenous cultures in Africa, in Asia, something to contribute. I'll give you two examples because I've been working in Africa, especially in Lesotho, Ethiopia, also in Asia, in Thailand, in a river dispute between Thailand, China, and Burma. Now, there is a community mediation process that is very much reasonable for even small communities, but even universities like Cook, for instance. Cook could be one. And it's called Oponopono, and it comes from the Pacific Islands, and it's a fantastic method of community mediation that we have been using in the United States at the University of Maryland when working in other parts of the South in particular, for instance in Lesotho, but also in Latin America, in Guatemala. We have been using a method that comes from the Pacific Islands. So I don't want to belittle the traditional contribution to modern conflict resolution. However, I think there's a lot to learn because much of the change process, change basically generates conflict. And the question of change is necessary. And the question is whether the conflict is going to be dealt with destructively or constructively. And very often it is dealt with destructively. Surely the Middle East with the Arab Spring is a good example. I mean, good intentions and then very bad results at the moment at least. So what I'm saying is there is a lot to learn from the practitioners who have been working on the field. And even in Latin America, when you look at the protests, massive protests, including in Brazil, there is an issue of, I call it hyper-mobilization of the masses, which I can understand coming from times of dictatorship where there was no way to negotiate your rights with a dictatorial regime. And now there are regimes as left as you can wish. And how much can you get by empowering civil society negotiations will be much more than just popular protests occupying the public space, the things that really are not conducive to concrete results. Well, the very widely shared wisdom says that the traditions are now being replaced by change in the Middle East, and the transitions from autocratic military rules to democracy have been successful in Latin America. I said in my lecture the other day that when I started writing about human rights in '76, 80% of the states in Latin America were under military rule, and now there is no one under military rule. So there couldn't be any better expert of transitions to democracy than Latin America, especially when we talk about military rule like Egypt or Syria. Of course, there are other reasons for conflict there, like religion, that has not been the case in Latin America, but there are many useful lessons to learn. We also have to bear in mind that the other parts of the South that have been till very late the focus of colonialism and neo-colonialism, the European powers have lost the credibility to do a genuine conflict transformation without necessarily having ulterior motives, let alone the United States, that in the Middle East it's so clear that if you can be a good friend of Saudi Arabia, one of the most autocratic regimes in the world, you cannot really say democracy is good and not to do anything in Saudi Arabia just simply because of economic interests or because the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and this kind of policies of the United States. So I think Latin America is very well placed, also by their own experience, by the exclusion of other, in inverted commas, developed countries that have a lot of experience, yes, in conflict resolution, universities and so on. When just one word when it comes to kingdoms, and we still have a number of them in the Middle East. And there, I mean, it's not military rule, it's a different type of autocratic rule. And lucky for Latin America, kings have gone from Brazil, you know, so long ago that nobody thinks about a methodology to transmit power from a monarchy to a democracy. So it's a different thing, but the one thing that Brazil and other countries can do in Latin America is to try to show the experience of civil society trying to use non-violent means, not like the guerrilla of the 60s, but non-violent means for conflict and transformation. And I think that overall, this is high time for a South-South transfer of knowledge in the field of conflict resolution. Well, I'll mention names and countries to start with, and depending on how much time do you want me to develop each of the examples, I'll do so if asked. You know, we learn both what we call lessons learned when things do not go well, and we call it best practices when things go well. I'm now talking about best practices, but if you would ask me also about failures, I could also talk about failures, unfortunately. But that's a way of learning, I think. There is no shortcut but by trial and error. Now, for the successful examples, in my personal experience of working for now a couple of decades in the field, Latin America is going first, and then I could perhaps mention another example. The one that I'm very proud of is an interstate conflict between Peru and Ecuador. I mean, there was a last war, small war though, in 1995 called the Cenepa War, with border dispute between Ecuador and Peru on the Amazon area. And we were able, before the official negotiations restarted after the war, and we were able to have the top leaders of civil society from Peru and Ecuador meeting, and over 5 years, 2.5 years before the signing of the peace agreement between Ecuador and Peru, and 2 years afterwards. And one of your colleagues, Dr. Monica Hertz, wrote about Peru, Ecuador, and I'm so honored that she mentioned our contribution as a track to, and we also wrote some academic articles that I could refer to. That's one. The latest one, and the one we're going to be talking tonight, is so timely, which has to do with Cuba, USA. And this is another interstate conflict. You know, people say that the negotiations have been going on for 18 months between the official negotiations with Cuba and USA. Well, we ended a year ago a diplomacy that the Cubans like to call academic diplomacy, and not track two, between Cuban academics and US academics. And the Cuban academics were experts on US, and the US academics were experts on Cuba. And they met for 3.5 years, and about a year before the breakthrough Cuba-USA, we met and submitted 25 recommendations to the two governments in Havana and Washington, precisely to do the two chief negotiators that now negotiated the agreement, Roberta Jacobson and, on my memory, Josefina Vidal, and the Cuban one. So there was an impact. And I'm also checking the recommendations. Some of the recommendations have happened already and are happening. So we are very proud of this ability to provide some wisdom to the official policy of both Cuba and the USA. Just to give one example of Africa where I have much less experience, in Lesotho, after training the university professors from the University of Lesotho in Roma, it's called Roma, they, with our help, over a couple of years, we tried to mobilize people that were in conflict. On the one hand, the chiefs of local government, traditional by heritage chiefs, and the commoners who wanted democracy at the municipal level that was not available before. There was already a democratic rule or majority rule at the national level. In this particular case, we were able to work at all levels, including, at the end of the day, the Prime Minister himself coming to participate in our, and they were able to have an agreement about elections at the local level, and the chiefs agreed with, I call them the commoners, I mean, those who are just citizens, for a transition to elections. So I think that, and again, we have published academic articles on that. I wish I could give you good examples on the Middle East. Having worked quite a bit, surely Israel, Palestine a lot, and also with Jordan and Egypt, and also on the Nile River. But all in all, I can say that the level of civil society, there's been a lot of exploration of common ground. Israel, Palestine, we sort of signed peace agreements called the Geneva Accord and so on. Unfortunately, the governments, perhaps one side more than the other, have been not very recipient of these recommendations, although I believe it had an impact, but not a decisive impact like in the other cases as we are now talking about.